Hi there, I want to welcome you to Old Testament 101, and we are covering today, we're actually covering 6 books, but they actually were together as three separate books, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, and First and Second Chronicle. And so we have already worked our way from Genesis up to the book of Ruth. And so we have seen God use Abraham and his descendants to bless them and to use them. They're going to play a big part they play a huge part in the Bible story. And so, which will eventually make its way to Jesus. And so the patriarchs, they were supposed to be a group that represented what God was going to do. And obviously they failed miserably, and we kind of worked our way then through Exodus and the people in slavery, and then them coming out of slavery as they were heading to this promised land to be a unique people, to be a blessing to the world. They obviously did not do well there. Eventually, when they got into the promised land, we talked about in our last discussion last week, we talked about how they just were miserable as far as falling away from the Lord in the book of Judges. And we began to see a little bit of hope through the book of Ruth, that even though it's a love story, it is a story that sets up a redemption that God's going to use as we see that Ruth is the great-grandmother of King David. And so today we want to begin in First Samuel. And so we're going to go ahead and turn to that. And so we are in First Samuel. And so the historical books of First and Second Samuel were originally one book. And so it wasn't until the Greek Septuagint was written that it was divided into 2 books. But eventually, or originally, it was just one large book. So the First Samuel covers the 94-year period from Samuel's birth to Saul's death. And this includes the change in Israel from the time of Judges, which we talked about last week, to now the time of the Kings. And so real quick, authorship, scholars are not totally sure on who wrote these 2 books. They believe that Samuel had probably written down quite a bit of the records, but also we're covering a large time of history here. And so he certainly has influence in the First and Second Samuel, but then when we move beyond that, in the Kings, we cover quite a bit of history. And so there's a belief that besides Samuel, there were other prophets, maybe Gad and Nathan, who recorded many of the events in King David's life. And then probably even later on, scribes wrote down some of the other events about the kings in Israel's history. So the book of Samuel was probably written around 926 BC. So the purpose of First Samuel is to show how God's authority over Israel was demonstrated through Israel's kings, and especially through the rise of David. So David plays a prominent part in the story. The themes of First Samuel include Israel's change in government. They're going to go from judges to kings. And then there's the consequences of the sins that affect the rulers. And we're going to see that with especially our first king, King Saul, and his sins. And then in First Samuel, it's structured around the lives of the prophet Samuel. And that's focuses on chapters 1 through 7. And then chapters 8 through 31 revolve around King Saul. And then David, who's Israel's greatest king, is yet to be enthroned in first chapter, but or in First Samuel, but he has been set aside for that purpose. So historical background: First Samuel is again set in this 94-year period between Samuel's birth and also Saul's defeat and death at Gilboa. And so the book ends with Saul's death. So during this time, the people of Israel were begging God for a king. If you remember, as you were reading earlier books, God kept saying, "No, I don't want to give you a king. I am your king." But Israel insisted. They wanted to have a king like the other nations, and so God decides He's going to allow them to have a king. And so Israel changes its whole government. During the time of Judges, those were just regional leaders. And so now we're going to go from sort of a confederation of states and groups to one central government where a king is going to look over all these governments, all these different regions, the different tribes is probably a better way to say that. So the development of the message of God's ultimate rule plays through this. He is the authority, but he develops these leaders in Israel. And God will remove his blessing if the leader decides not to be faithful. And we see that throughout this book. So the book develops from Eli, one of the priests, to then Samuel. And the book starts out with the story of how Samuel is called, and his mother Hannah, who she devotes Samuel to the priesthood and to the work there. And then we have the transition from Samuel to Saul, and Saul becomes then the first king of Israel. And then we're going to see, even though Saul is king, we're going to begin to see the transition from Saul to David, and David's going to be anointed, but this transition is going to take some time. So he is set as king, but he doesn't take that position right away. So the theology of First Samuel, it centers on the rule of God over all things. God's rule is established through a strong central leadership or kingship. It begins with Saul and will continue through David. First Samuel's theology also shows that no one, not even prophets and kings, can disobey God and expect to achieve what he wants. And we're going to see this, especially in First Samuel. We're going to see this with King Saul. That King Saul was a person that God showed favor to, but when Saul did not want to do what God had asked him, then he removed his favor. So some ways that you can preach this, you can focus on Samuel, and you can focus on their strengths and their weaknesses. Samuel was a strong national leader as a judge and a prophet, but weak in terms in leading his family into righteousness. His sons were not really good characters. And so you can preach the need for leaders to have a strong home. Saul was a strong warrior in battle, right? He was fighting God's causes, but could not win the battle over his own will to obey God's commands. And so you could preach these. So the outline of Samuel is laid out like this. Samuel becomes really the last judge of Israel, chapters 1 through 7. And so that leadership changes from Eli to Samuel. And so then chapter 4 through chapter 7, we have Samuel as a judge. And then the first king of Israel is Saul. We move into chapters 8 through 31. And so we've seen this transition now from a judge to a king. Samuel does have some successes in that chapter 13, but not much. In other words, he changes quickly. And so then the leadership changes from Saul to David. God rejects Saul. David's anointed as king. And then God uses David to be a musician in the court of Saul. David fights God's enemies and Goliath. David has to flee from Saul because Saul knows something's up. Saul is no longer walking with the Lord, and so a lot going on there. So that is 1 Samuel. So let's talk about 2 Samuel now. In 2 Samuel, it tells us about David's reign. So now David has become king. Saul dies at the end of 1 Samuel. And so in this book, it records the major events of David's 40-year rule. David first reigns over Judah for 7 years, and then over Judah and Israel for the next 33 years. And so we have the reign, and we've already talked about the authorship and date. The purpose of 2 Samuel continues from 1 Samuel to show how God's authority over Israel was demonstrated, particularly through the rise and rule of King David. And so now the whole focus now is going to shift to King David. David was a big part of 1 Samuel, but he wasn't king, and now he's king. And so we begin to look at David's reign, and David is very successful. David wins a lot of victories, a lot of battles. David has a great relationship with God. David was the one who had written a lot of the Psalms that we have, and praises and worship songs. And so we see David as really what a king should be, what a righteous king should be. And so David is also shown as an ideal leader, kind of in an imperfect kingdom. And so, which points to Christ, right? Jesus is going to become the ideal leader in a world that has blemishes. So 2 Samuel is structured around David's triumphs. Chapters 1 through 10 focuses on his victories. Now, the book is going to make a change because we know starting in chapter 11 that David has personal sins, and then there's trouble that follows, and then both his family and the nation suffer greatly because of his sins. And so David's life and career are on the rise until he commits the sin of adultery and murder. And the book just really takes a different slant. So historically, Saul was the first king, but really, when we think of the kings of Israel, David is the greatest king of them all. So the development of the message, we've talked a little bit about this. In chapters 1 through 10, David builds on his political successes, his spiritual successes, military victories. David is doing everything right, and then comes chapter 11, where he commits sin by having a adulterous relationship with Bathsheba, ends up murdering Bathsheba's husband, and that affects not only David personally, but it affects his family. It's going to affect the nation, and all kinds of things that happen there. So the theology of this book is that God is going to continue redemption. Is evident in 2 Samuel that God is doing something, that he's acting upon his covenant. And so God is going to do that. God redeems David's desire to build a house for the Lord by announcing that his desire to build a house will not be happen for him, but it will be passed on to a son. So that is a little bit of that uniqueness, how to preach this book. I would say that the life of David is an amazing an example. I think we can show where King David, what faithfulness looks like, what covenant relationship looks like. But I think we also need to wrestle with his failures, and also to show that, hey, listen, sin affects not just you personally, not just your relationship with God, but it will also affect your family. It'll affect your church, your social gatherings. All these things will be impacted by that. And so I think also within David, we can show repentance and restoration and what that looks like. And even though that David repented and God restored him, there's still a lot of scars that happen within that. So that is, well, let me just cover this real quick. So this is just an outline. Already what we've talked about kind of shares the victories of David, those first 10 chapters. David's anointed, and then the battles and the murders and the struggle for Israel and things that go on. Judah and Israel unite under David. David defeats the Philistines in chapters 6-7. The ark returns to the city of David. God's covenant is with David. And so just everything turning right. And then there's the military victories and David's rule. And then we get to David's sins in chapter 11. We've already talked about that and the impact that that's had, which then causes the different troubles within his family, with his son, Absalom, there's incest within the family. And then there's David's troubles within the kingdom. And so just a kind of a sad story there. So that is 1st and 2nd Samuel. All right, so now we are going to move to 1st and 2nd Kings. So we are now in 1st Kings. So if you remember just a few seconds ago, as I was finishing this, David was king of all of Israel and of the whole nation. So 1st and 2nd Kings, then the introduction was originally, it was one book, as we've said. Together they offer a political history of Israel from the time of Solomon. So the focus on 1st Kings becomes the rule of Solomon until the beginning of the Babylonian captivity. So we're covering quite a time in there. And so the title of 1st and 2nd Kings actually came from the Latin Vulgate. And so the division of 1st and 2nd Kings into 2 books happened centuries before the Septuagint. So in 1st and 2nd Samuel, it was the Septuagint that divided the one book into 2. But here, the Septuagint actually just called these books 3 and 4 Kingdoms, having title 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kingdoms. And so anyhow, the authorship, the identity of the author is unknown. There's probably quite a few, could be a handful of authors, quite a few authors. We're covering a lot of time here, so there may have been some authors that had written things down. Some believe that possibly while the Jews were in exile, this was written down, which makes a lot of sense. It probably was. Some believe that could have been Ezra and Nehemiah. It's interesting that Jewish tradition says that the author was Jeremiah. So we don't want to overlook that. Likely date of its completion was 560 and 538 BC. I also think that you probably, you could be even looking at 2nd or 3rd century, possibly for the writing of this. The purpose of 1st and 2nd Kings is to record both the history of the kings of Israel and Judah and the spiritual lessons learned from their rule. The theme of both 1st and 2nd Kings is really to measure the kings of Israel and Judah according to their obedience to the law of Moses and the covenants of Abraham and David. So the first section in 1st Kings here, chapters 1 through 11, records Solomon's rule over the united kingdoms of Israel. The second section, starting in chapter 12, tells about the divided kingdoms. There was a civil war that takes place, and Israel and Judah divided, and they were then ruled by separate kings. Some historical background. 1st Kings covers about 120 years from the beginning of Solomon's reign, so around 971 BC to the end of Ahaziah's reign in 851 BC. During this time, the United Kingdom of Israel split into 2 kingdoms of Israel and Judah, somewhere around 931 BC. So the message of 1st Kings is that a divided heart results in a divided kingdom. And so 1st King tells us about the good days at the beginning of Solomon's reign. That's roughly the first 8 chapters, but then Solomon begins to fall. And Solomon's heart was divided between God, the God of his father David, and the gods of the different foreign lands. He had married a lot of foreign women, and coming along with that was there are many foreign gods, and that impacted Solomon. And Solomon became disobedient to God, and God ends up allowing the kingdom to be divided. And so we see some prophets that are in 1st Kings. They remind the rulers of Israel and Judah of their responsibility to obey God. And for the most part, most of the kings did not. There were some that did. In Israel, after the split, there are no good kings. They do some good acts, but just really no good kings. We have the prophet Elijah is the most visible prophet in 1st Kings. The theology of 1st Kings shows that God evaluates kings and men by different standards than those of the world system. So the kings of the covenant are judged not by how big or wealthy their kingdoms were, but by how obedient they were to God's laws and covenants. So an example that they give here is that King Omri is known by some scholars as the greatest king of Israel because his territory and alliances were so big. However, in the book of 1st Kings, it evaluates Omri by God's standards. And basically God says he did evil in his sight. And so he was not a good king. And so 1st Kings describes David as the standard Solomon should have lived by. He doesn't. And so, again, the theology of the book is that God evaluates people differently than people evaluate. Some ways that you can preach this. You can talk about God's standards and the world standards. You can talk about how we as a church, we are to be a unique people, and that we don't live according to the standards of this world, but that we live according to the standards of Jesus. And so those are just some ways that you can preach this. And so this is just an outline of 1st Kings, talking Solomon beginning his reign and his rise and then his fall. And then in chapter 12, we have the 2 kingdoms, Israel and Judah, dividing under Jeroboam and Rehoboam. And so then the rest of the book then talks about the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel. So let's go into 2nd Kings. And so 2nd Kings continues the divided history of Israel and Judah. We don't have to look at the authorship. We've talked about that some already, and also some of the purpose of these books. But I do want to highlight this, that 2nd Kings is structured around the stories of the kingdoms it tells about. So the book begins with the stories of the divided kingdom of Israel and Judah. The first section of 2 Kings ends with Israel falling captive to Assyria in 722 BC. And the second section, chapters 19 through 25, tell us about the kingdoms of Judah and then their fall, and then they're taken into captivity in 587 BC. And so that's really the history of 2 Kings. So some of the historical background is 131 years of the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah from the reign of Ahaziah of Israel starting in 853 BC until the fall of Israel into Assyrian captivity in 722. And then, of course, Judah falls to the Babylonians in 587. So a way that you could develop this, or the way that the message of 2 Kings is developed, is that the kings are responsible to live by God's standards as anyone else. As in much of the Old Testament, the success or failure of the kings of Israel and Judah is measured by their obedience to God's covenant. Okay, remember that the covenant was given back starting in Exodus and working its way through Deuteronomy. And so basically these kings were judged based upon that. Just as Elijah was a prominent prophet in 1 Kings, Elisha becomes the most prominent prophet in 2 Kings. So the theology, 2 Kings shows that God controls both history and human activity. Even though the kings are falling short, God still controls what's going on. And so even to the point where God will punish people, because he said, remember, he will bless those that do right, but those who do wrong will be cursed. And so we see this. Some ways that you could preach this is 2 Kings shows that God is always ready to help people who turn to him. And he's faithful even when we're not. And so there were times in 2 Kings where different kings would turn to God. And usually that was almost always the kings of Judah, not necessarily the kings of Israel. So this is just an outline. We've talked about this of the divided kingdoms, and so this just follows that, and you can look at that in your books. All right. All right. Now we are going to cover in our last little section here, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. 1st and 2nd Chronicles were originally one book. Again, I told you there was 3 books, and they've all been divided into. The books were separated in the Greek Old Testament called the Septuagint. So like 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, the same thing. The Chronicles cover the same time in Jewish history as 2nd Samuel through 2nd Kings. So there's a lot of parallel stuff, though about 1/2 of the material is repeated in the earlier Old Testament books. There is a difference between Samuel and the Kings and Chronicles. Chronicles tells about the history from the viewpoint of those Jews who returned from the exile in Persia to rebuild Jerusalem. The Chronicles take their title from Jerome's, and Jerome was a 4th century church leader from Jerome's Latin Vulgate, which titled them the Chronicles of the Whole of Sacred History. So scholars are not certain who wrote Chronicles. Jewish tradition says the Chronicles are the work of Ezra. So many scholars place the date of completion of Chronicles around 425 BC. So the purpose of 1st Chronicles was to inspire the remnant of Israel who had returned to Jerusalem to rebuild their nation and their temple, to trust God and his promises. So the events themselves will start earlier in history, but they are to be an inspiration to the remnant that is coming back into the land after they had been in captivity. The theme of First Chronicles is that God himself founded David's kingdom because of his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So remember, that's a huge theme throughout the whole Bible. So the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem also becomes an important theme at the end of First Chronicles. First Chronicles is structured in two major sections. The first, chapters 1-9, tell about David's royal family line. Chronicles is one of two books in the Bible that cover all of human history from creation to the author's day. So the other book being Matthew, that covers that. And then the second section, chapters 10-29, tell about David's reign as king. First Chronicles first notes David's family line that we've talked about, and then it emphasizes God's covenant with David through major events in David's life. So how would this message develop then? First Chronicle tells us about the connection between the Jewish exiles and God's promises. It makes the connection that God promises were still in effect for the exiles. And so just because the kingdoms and the kings had fallen, that God was still going to be faithful to his people. So that's why they begin to show David's family line, so that the people can connect to that. And it continues with God's covenant with David, and then demonstrates that David's kingdom was established on the true worship of God. And ultimately, David would have a successor, and that would become Jesus. Theology-wise, First Chronicles shows that God alone deserves our worship and honor. And so that's a big part of the theology of the book. Uniqueness in how to preach it in your church plant. Worship means to revere and give honor to the worth of someone or something. And so First Chronicles shows that David wanted to make worship of God a central part of life in Israel. And I think you can talk about worship and the importance of that, and you can use Chronicles to do that. So this is just kind of an outline, the family line that we talked about from Adam to Jacob, and then Jacob to the generations mentioned there in Chronicles, and then the history of King David, and Saul's death, and different stories about David. Let's move to Second Chronicles. So the purpose of Second Chronicles was to remind the remnant of Israel that even though the kings after David were not always faithful, God was still faithful to his covenant promises to David. And so the theme of Second Chronicles is God's commitment to his covenant with David in the time of the kings after David's death. So the dedication, the decline and destruction of the temple are major themes in this book. Second Chronicles is structured into two major sections. The first section is chapters 1-9, tells us about Solomon's reign as king. And then the second, chapters 10-36, tells us about the many kings of the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And then this covers all the way until Cyrus decreed that the Jewish exiles in Persia could return and rebuild Jerusalem in 538 BC. So Second Chronicles tells us about the time between the start of Solomon's reign through the time of Cyrus and the rebuilding of the temple. So the way that you could develop this message is that Second Chronicles tells us about God's faithfulness in keeping his covenant promises to David, even though as a nation, it seemed like a failure. And so it also, the message develops on the worship of God. So the theology of it is that Second Chronicles shows us how deep, or how God keeps his covenant promises through preserving David's descendants, even though they're scattered and they're in captivity. God is still faithful. A way that you could preach this, Second Chronicles emphasizes how important prayer is in our relationship with God. There's some different examples of prayer in this book, and so this is just some ways that Second Chronicles is outlined, and so that is the end of that book. So that is a lot that we've covered. And so again, the purpose of this class is not to get into every detail going on to the book, but just trying to give us an overview of the bigger story of what's going on. So appreciate your time, and keep living for the Lord.